Dennis Moore was born in Anthony, Kansas, and graduated from the University of Kansas and Washburn University School of Law. He served in the U.S. Army and Army Reserves and as an Assistant Attorney General for the state of Kansas. He entered legal practice in Johnson County, where he was elected District Attorney in 1976. He returned to private practice before being elected U.S. Representative from the 3rd District, where he has served 3 terms. He is the only Democrat from Kansas in Congress. In conversation with Representative Moore is Dr. Bob Beatty, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Washburn University.
Congressman Moore, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
And I hope you might be able to take some of this cold weather back to Washington, D.C. with you.
It's colder here than it is in Washington.
I want to start off by asking you about the Democratic primaries and caucuses. At one point we had John Edwards, Dennis Kucinich, John Kerry, Bob Graham, Howard Dean, Carol Moseley Braun, Wesley Clark, Al Sharpton, Dick Gephardt, and Joseph Lieberman. Did you put your support behind any candidate at any point?
No, I haven't. In fact, I was approached by 4 or 5 of the candidates for the Democratic nomination for president, and I said respectfully to them, I said, when you win by 2.5% as I do for the last 3 elections, you have to kind of focus on your own, so good luck to you. And they at least indicated they understood that. Maybe they didn't appreciate it, but they understood my point of view, I think.
What do you think of what's been happening? Howard Dean, of course, rose to the top of the polls, and everyone thought he was on his way to the nomination. Actually, a number of politicians sort of jumped on his bandwagon, including Al Gore. And then John Kerry sort of shocks many people and wins Iowa, wins New Hampshire. What's your take on all of this?
Well, my take is it's not over till it's over, and the pundits can always be wrong, and they certainly were in this particular case, and we just have to wait and see what people want and who they want for the nominee for that party, and they'll make a decision. I think we're going to see more of a win-and-win process in the next several weeks, too. Next few days, actually.
And what was Howard Dean tapping into? Because he did get a lot of support.
Well, sure
right
he
off
did.
the bat.
He sure did, and he was a plain speaker, and sometimes a little too much of a plain speaker, I suppose, but he had some grassroots populist support, I think, and I think some people, I don't know, they can judge for themselves who they want for this nomination now.
Do you think the Iowa caucuses are good? Because this might be an example where people got a real long, hard look at a number of the candidates and then switched after seeing them a number of times. Other people think there should be some more national primary. What's your opinion on this?
My preference would be more of a national primary with people talking to the American people all around the country, because it tends to, the way it is right now, it tends to focus more on particular geographic areas like Iowa or New Hampshire, wherever, but we have what we have.
How about Kansas? Should we move up our caucuses or have some sort of primary and be more involved? Because right now the Democratic caucus, I believe, is in March, which usually comes after the decision's been made.
Whatever we do, I don't think many presidential candidates will spend much time in Kansas. It's kind of a foregone conclusion here, I think. We
can talk about that a little bit later. You've survived 2 elections, correct?
Yes.
And I say survived because you mentioned they've been narrow.
Actually had 3 elections, but the first one then survived 2 more. Right?
Okay, right. Tell us a little bit about gerrymandering. A number of people aren't clear about what that means, and I know you've been involved sort of in that process.
Well, I don't get involved in that process, but I've survived the process, I guess.
I guess it, yeah.
Every 10 years under the Constitution, the state legislatures of the states are required to adjust their congressional boundaries to reflect an equal number of constituents in each of their congressional boundaries. And the number is around 650,000. We have 4 members of Congress in Kansas, and try to keep that as equal as possible in terms of population, so everybody has equal representation. And my district right now is Johnson County, Wyandotte County, and about half of Lawrence, from Iowa Street east back towards Kansas City. Prior to that time, before this last legislature in Kansas adjusted the boundaries, it included almost all of Douglas County, but because of the phenomenal growth in Lawrence and Johnson County and in the district, they had to adjust the boundaries, and I had to lose some people, frankly.
And I've heard complaints that gerrymandering makes the districts more safe for a number of candidates, but that then can produce more extreme policies in Congress, because I mean, there's no need to bargain or negotiate if you know every 2 years you're going to win that seat. Do you see any evidence of that?
what I hear, and the conventional wisdom is there's maybe 25 or 30 so-called marginal seats where there really is a contest for the congressional election every 2 years, and at the rest of them there's 435 members of Congress, so about 415 maybe are so-called safe seats. I happen to be in the position of being in one of those seats that's going to be closely contested every time. I guess I'm the only Democrat in the congressional delegation. I was the first Democrat elected in my district in about 38 years. I think the first Democrat re-elected in that district in 80 years or something like that. And I tell people, really, I think most people in this country are maybe registered Republican or Democrat, but they don't really care that much about partisan politics. They're more concerned about their families, their jobs, their kids' education, all those things it takes to live in this world. But they do, at the time they really start to focus on partisan politics is maybe 3 or 4 weeks before an election. If they know and feel comfortable with the candidate, I think they'll vote for that person irrespective of their party. If they don't know that person, I think, or if they don't know or feel comfortable with the person who's representing them, I think they'll probably vote their party. So that's kind of the way it works, and that's the way I see it.
It must be difficult in a sense, and of course challenging and exciting, some would say, but every 2 years, the president will come out and try to unseat you.
What do you mean?
Does that get frustrating, or when you're in Congress and you're talking to these people from the safe seats and you say, you don't understand, this is what I have going on in my district? Do you have to bring that up?
I don't normally say that because I think they do understand what happens in my district, and they're interested in. There's this struggle always going on in Congress, and I think most people look at what's happening in Congress and get very frustrated, just as I do when you're right in the middle of it. And I guess that's one of the things I really dislike most about being in Congress is the ungodly partisanship that goes on there, and both sides do it. And I think most of the people in Congress, 85% at least, are good, decent, honorable people who want to do the right thing for the people in this country. Then there's a handful of, and I won't call them jerks, but people on each side who've been in control for a long time, and they want to maintain control and get control if they don't have it, and so there's this constant tension and struggle going on. And I think the best thing we can do, and I'm talking about the great majority of members of Congress, is to work together on issues that really are what the American people want. And I know there's some good faith, honest differences between some folks on some issues, and that's fine. That's the way our system's worked. And I also tell people, and I try to do this, sometimes when I really get frustrated, I take a deep breath and step back and think about the fact that our country has not only survived but thrived for more than 225 years. And that's, there's some places in middle America, Central America, where they change governments there about as often as we change light bulbs. So we really have a great system here, and I think the best country in the whole world.
On your website, it said you're a member of the Blue Dog Coalition.
Yes, sir.
And you don't look blue, but you're also a member of the New Democrat Coalition.
Yes.
What are those?
Well, the New Democrat group is a group of Democrats that tend to be pro-business and tend to be focused on budget and economy, but and I say pro-business in the sense that if our businesses operate and do well, then people have jobs, things of that nature. The Blue Dog Coalition is a group of conservative Democrats, and I think the number is 37 right now. On social issues, they're all over the board, so we really don't take positions on social issues. The real thing the thread that runs through the Blue Dog Coalition that ties us all together is our belief in fiscal responsibility, in balanced budgets, and trying to pay down debt when we can. I think that is so very important right now. In fact, almost every time I speak to a group back in district, I talk about the need for fiscal responsibility, and I think we were talking before the show started here. Alan Greenspan, who's the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, comes before I'm on the Budget Committee and the Financial Services Committee, so twice a year at least I have a chance to ask questions of Chairman Greenspan. And the one question I ask almost every time is, what can Congress do that's going to be most beneficial in terms of helping our country and our economy? And he says fiscal responsibility, balanced budgets, and when we can, paying down debt. And what Chairman Greenspan said to us several times in the past 5 years is that when this economy takes off and really gets chugging again, if we're not in a fiscally responsible position, we could see interest rates start to shoot up like they did, and you may be too young to remember the late 70s, but we had interest rates in this country.
I've heard stories.
Yeah, you've heard stories.
20% interest rate.
16, 17, 18%, honestly, and that would just be devastating to business, to real estate, to almost any consumer borrowing in this country. So we've got to protect against that.
Let's talk about that. We'll get to the Medicare bill a little later, but
Sure.
you've started talking about the deficit.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about, we had the tax cuts, okay, but we now have a deficit. Let's start with the tax cuts. Do tax cuts spur, economic growth? I think that's the big question, because a number of analysts say, well, they can, but it depends upon what kind of tax cuts.
Absolutely, and I agree with that. Tax cuts, I think, can spur economic growth if it's an appropriate tax cut. And if it's a tax cut that gets people working, creates jobs or whatever, then that is a good stimulus for the economy. If it's a tax cut that simply says, let's repeal the estate tax, that probably doesn't do much, in my opinion, to stimulate the economy, because people who are subject to an estate tax like that and are concerned about repeal the estate tax tend to have a lot of money, and that doesn't mean it's going to be new investment necessarily. So there are very few things that are all black and white, and there's at least, I practiced law for 28 years before I was in Congress, there are at least two sides to every story, and I think it's important that we really look at all the different parts of an issue before we make decisions. What I did, for example, as an alternative to repeal the estate tax, was support a bill that would increase the $675,000 exemption to $3 million a person. That for a husband and wife, that'd be $6 million. That's going to cover 99% of the people in this country. But it's not going to protect Bill Gates and other people like that from some estate tax. And when the president talks about let's permanently repeal all of that, or let's put these, let's repeal the estate tax totally, that's going to cost billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars to our Treasury over the next several years, and we just don't have the money to do that right now. So I think we need to look for some middle ground and find some reasonable, common sense approaches to some of these issues.
And you're always an interesting person to talk to, but especially interesting considering being a blue dog Democrat. We were talking about this a little bit before the show. When I was younger, there was always the idea that the Republican Party, cut spending, they stuck to budgets, they wanted balanced budget amendments.
Mm-hmm.
And the Democrats, they were always being accused of being tax and spenders. And now it's 2004, and we have a Republican Congress, Republican president, and yes, we have a national security problem, but the deficit is wacko. I mean, the deficit is just wild out the window. Should we just throw out those stereotypes? I mean, is this a new politics in which we have to reevaluate the parties?
Well, times have changed, and I think, frankly, the parties have changed as well, and I think it's important that people get a real view of what's going on here. And again, everything's not black and white. The Republicans have some good ideas, Democrats have some good ideas, and I think it's important that members of Congress, as well as the people out in this country, not just vote straight party lines. I try to look at issues on an issue-by-issue basis. If the president's right, I'm going to support the president. 2.5 years ago, the president proposed a tax cut. We were in surplus mode at that time and had, in fact, had a $5.6 trillion projected surplus. Mm-hmm. I voted for the president's tax cut and made some of my Democratic friends unhappy. On the other hand, last year, the president asked for additional tax cuts. We were in deficit instead of surplus mode at that time as a nation. And I just couldn't justify doing that without the president coming forward and saying, here's how we're going to pay for these tax cuts. I supported an alternative proposal, about half of the president's tax cut, but it was paid for by cuts in other areas. And I think we've got to be fiscally responsible here and do the right thing. I coined a phrase, Bob, I call the debt tax. And the debt tax is the interest we pay on our national debt. Right now, it's almost $1 billion a day. It's the third largest category of expenditure in our nation after national defense and after Social Security and Medicare. And we're getting to a position right now with a $7 trillion national debt. And it's more than $350 billion a year in interest on the national debt that's almost unsustainable for future generations. What we're doing right now is taking our national charge card and we're trying to feel good by charging new tax cuts or new spending on this charge card. And we're saying we'll take this right now, but let's let our kids and grandkids pay for it. That's not right.
Yeah, well, one reason to solve it may be just to avoid having Ross Perot come back, but that may be good too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's think positively. What can be done? We know the deficit's there. What are some steps we can take? Obviously, maybe looking again at the tax cuts. Are there some other steps? Maybe cuts. Nobody likes to cut anything, but
Well,
Do we have to do that?
In any organization, whether it's a business, whether it's government, I'm sure there is waste and duplication, and we can cut some things. In fact, there have been base closing commissions that talk about closing some military bases that don't need to stay open anymore and can save billions of dollars for taxpayers, and we should do those things. And we've talked about tax cuts, and when the President says we want to extend these tax cuts permanently, well, I don't think we can afford to do all of them permanently. And we should pick and choose again carefully and not say it's all or nothing. It doesn't have to be that way. But we do need to find ways to cut spending as well, and there are areas. I know the Governor Sebelius here has had a commission that reviewed all of state spending and come up with some recommendations for cuts. We kind of need to do that on the national level as well, I think, and we can find some inefficiencies, some waste, and make some cuts there. And we need to do that as a nation. And Republicans and Democrats need to come together and work on this together. And I think there's a group of conservative Republicans in Congress, together with some of the conservative Democrats and the group that I belong to, that will maybe start working together in the future and say, Mr. President, we support you when we think you're right, but we're going to respectfully say when we think you're wrong, there's a better way to do this.
Let's talk about health insurance and Medicare. And the segue is that I read, and you can tell me, that on the debate over the Medicare bill and prescription drug aspect of that, the conference committees, the Democrats were shut out of those. Is that true?
That is true. And I mean, that is something that really has not happened in this country before. I hope that the Republican leadership will say, well, we made a mistake there, we're not going to do that again, because they've got the votes if they want to push something through and they keep their people together to pass whatever they want to. But I think it's wrong when we exclude, and I'd say the same thing if the Democrats were in control and did that. It should not happen, period.
And this, in the early 90s, I remember, of course, President Clinton with his health care initiative, which failed. And here we are 12 years later, and 43 million estimated without health insurance. Much like the deficit, we're seeing these issues come back, sort of to bite us in the captain's quarters, so to speak.
Not much new in the world, is there?
Let's talk about health insurance and what can we do about that, try to be positive. What can we do to try to tackle this problem?
Health insurance is a huge problem. It's an election year, and sometimes in election years it gets even more difficult to solve some of the big problems because the parties tend to get more partisan and they're trying to get control of Congress and all that. I'm not sure this year anything really positive and good is going to happen as far as health insurance. We need, and we've done a pretty good job in this country, of taking care of the people who are under 18 years of age, children, with the CHIPS program, Children's Health Insurance Program, and taking care of senior adults with Medicare. Done a pretty good job of that on the two extremes. But we've kind of taken the position as a nation over the years that if you're between 18 and 65 and not disabled, then you sort of have a responsibility to take care of yourself. Well, that's fine, except as you indicated, there are 43 million people approximately in this country who don't have health insurance, and sometimes if you don't have health insurance, it means you don't have access to health care unless you go to an emergency room, and that is the most inefficient way to provide medical services and the most costly way to provide medical services. So we have to do a better job as a nation, I think, of trying to make sure those 43 million people in the center who don't have health insurance are somehow covered and have access to health care. But the other thing I want to mention very quickly is when you talk about the high cost of health care in this country, and it is very, very high. We have some of the best health care, but it's very expensive. One of the cost drivers is prescription drugs and the high cost of prescription drugs. And you saw with this Medicare bill that was passed back in December and signed into law by the President. And I tell you what, I struggled with that, how I was going to vote on that, because I really wasn't decided. I got a call from Secretary Tommy Thompson, Secretary of Health and Human Services, the day before the vote. And I'd met with him. In fact, he met with our Blue Dog group 2 days before that. And he said, Congressman, can you be with us on this vote? I said, Mr. Secretary, anytime you have a piece of major legislation, as this is, it's over 500 pages long, I said there's always some good news and there's some bad news. And the good news here is it provides catastrophic coverage for seniors and it provides low-income coverage for seniors. And he says, well, what's the problem? And I said, Mr. Secretary, the problem is it does nothing to address the cost issue in a meaningful fashion. And I said, our seniors are paying the highest cost for prescription drugs of any seniors in the world. And I said there are 25 million veterans in this country, and the Secretary of Veterans Affairs can negotiate with pharmaceutical companies to try to get lower costs for them. They've got that right under federal law. I said, I wish you had the same right to negotiate on behalf of 40 million Medicare beneficiaries. He said, Congressman, if Congress would give me that authority, I'd gladly exercise it, but as you know, this law prohibits that. And I said, that's my big problem with this law.
Well, John McCain actually said that was outrageous.
Exactly.
Why does this law prohibit that?
This is going to sound partisan, but I think what it is a bow to the pharmaceutical companies. And frankly, it's going to cut into their profits if the Secretary of HHS is able to negotiate lower drug prices with the pharmaceutical companies, and they don't want their profits cut. And I understand that. In fact, I voted a few months before this for reimportation of drugs from Canada, and when the thing passed the House with broad bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats voted for it. It didn't. I don't think it passed the Senate. But what John McCain, I think, is saying there is the seniors in this country need some concessions and some consideration when it comes to drug prices. And we've got to find a way to do that. If we can do that, we can start to hold down, I think, healthcare costs in this country.
So you're for going to Canada?
Well, I voted for that, and frankly, it's one way to do it. I think a better way to do it, and I filed a bill with Joanne Emerson, who's a Republican from Missouri, a good friend, and we filed a bill together, and we have Republicans and Democrats on this bill to repeal one section of this Medicare bill that passed that prohibits the Secretary from negotiating with pharmaceutical companies and gives the Secretary specific authority to do just that. If we could get that to happen, I think that would do as much as anything we can do as a Congress to address this high-cost issue.
Does this problem go back to what we discussed at the beginning of the program, which we have a philosophical difference between some in both parties, Republican Party saying government shouldn't have anything to do with health care, and some in the Democratic Party saying we need to help out these folks,
Sure.
and then nothing's getting done in the middle because there's not a big enough group that wants to see it get done?
Well, I hope that that's going to change, and I hope, as I said, Joanne Emerson's going to be able to lead some of her moderate Republican friends here, and I'm going to try to get some Democrats, and if we can get the magic numbers 218 to pass something in the House, half of 435 plus one, if we can get 218 people to support this proposal, we can get it passed, and I hope that's what happens.
What do you say to people who say, well, this is socialized medicine and socialized medicine doesn't work? What do you say to those people?
Well, this proposal certainly is not socialized medicine. In fact, I don't believe in price controls. I don't like price controls. I want a free economy. You know, our pharmaceutical companies are not the devil. They really have made some miracle discoveries that improve quality of life and keep people out of hospitals and even preserve life. And I told 3 representatives of one of the pharmaceutical companies, I won't name after the reimportation vote, they called my office in Overland Park and said, we'd like to visit with the congressman. They came in, I sat at the table, and they said, we'd like to understand your vote on this reimportation. I said, look, I don't think for 1 minute this is a silver bullet or an answer to a complex problem. What I wanted to do is get the attention of the pharmaceutical companies, make you all understand there's a problem here, and invite you to sit down at the table with us and help solve this problem, instead of just kind of standing on the outside and saying, what are you going to do about this? And that's what I think is a more rational approach to try to solve problems rather than just calling each other names. That's not going to help.
So this will probably be played out more at the presidential election level, because you said Congress is not going to be able to tackle the larger issue, at least this year.
I'm sure it'll be an issue in the presidential race, obviously, but Congress needs to deal with this. Whether we can do it this year, I don't know, but I sure hope we try.
Let's shift to education.
Sure.
What's your view on the No Child Left Behind Act and the problems or pluses of this program?
I told you when the president's right, I've tried to support the president. When he's wrong, I respectfully say, Mr. President, there's a better way. I voted for No Child Left Behind, as did a majority, again, of Republicans and Democrats. And who can be for any child leaving any child behind? I don't talk to one single teacher, any educator who says, I want to leave these kids behind. Nobody believes that. It's a great soundbite, and it's got some good objectives too, and that is to make sure that every child learns that we hold teachers and schools and education systems accountable, and that children aren't just promoted from one grade to another because they become a year older. I believe all those things, and I think most Americans do. On the other hand, now that the law is in place, it's become obvious, I think there are some problems that need to be addressed and some deficiencies in the law. Let me give you a couple of examples. One is funding. There was a law passed in 1975 by Congress called IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And Congress at that time said to local school boards and state school boards, You take special needs, special education children out of hospitals and institutions, bring them to public schools for education, and we'll pay 40%. Well, Bob, 28 years later, instead of paying the 40% any one of those years, the highest Congress ever paid was last year. It was almost 19%, less than half of what was promised. And I never thought in my whole life that Congress and the administration would do something like that again, and yet it's happened with No Child Left Behind. The first year, they're $7 billion short of what was promised in funding. And when we're putting additional responsibilities on educational institutions, on teachers, on school districts, and saying you have to do this and this and this, federal mandates, to come along and then say we're not going to provide the funding that we promised is just not right. It's a broken promise by Congress. That should be corrected. One more thing, and then let's talk. There were created in this law what are called subgroups, and as few as 30 children can constitute a subgroup. And a couple of subgroups, for example, are children who speak another language besides English as their first language. Another subgroup, again, is special needs, special education kids. There are some kids in this country who are so profoundly disabled, and it's not their fault at all, that they can't reasonably be expected to keep pace with their peers in learning these materials. They just don't have the ability because they're special needs kids. And we should help them, but we shouldn't punish public schools who can't keep those kids current with their progress with their contemporaries. The other example, very quickly, is the English as second language children. They come here from another country with their parents. They speak not one word of English, and yet within 2 years they're expected to be able to progress with their peers, and that's not reality either. I'm told by educators it takes about 5 years for a child to learn enough English and be conversant enough in English to be able to keep pace in learning in school. And so to expect a child like that to keep pace, again, is not reality. And to punish schools and say they're on improvement or they're a failing school because they can't do what's impossible is not reality. Those parts need to be corrected.
I think a number of viewers listening to this would think this sounds a little odd, that a congressperson or a senator would vote for a program, and then when the spending allocation comes up for that would not vote to adequately fund them. I think a lot of viewers would think this is really strange.
Sounds strange to me too.
Would that senator or congressperson, when asked, you know, you support this program, yes, but you won't fund it, what's their answer? Is it just that, oh, they don't need that much money, or oh, they'll find it somewhere, or what's their response?
What I've heard some of the members of Congress and people from the administration say is we're putting more money into education right now than we've ever put in before.
But that doesn't answer the specific question of that specific program that is not funded.
That's exactly right.
I think the viewers and voters would say, then don't vote for the program if you can't pay for it.
Well, that's what I would say too, and I honestly believed at the time I voted for this that we would never repeat the mistake we did with IDEA and that we would fully fund this program. And I just don't think it's fair or right for us to impose additional federal mandates on local school boards and state school boards and say you have to meet these requirements and then not fund the program the way it was supposed to be funded.
Well, philosophically, let's look at education. In Kansas, of course, we're dealing with rulings that say that it's essentially illegal to fund, for one school to be funded higher than another. What about nationally? We know that there's schools in big cities, New Orleans, Detroit, Philadelphia, where you walk into the schools and they don't have chalk, they don't have materials, their walls are crumbling. And where I grew up, Lake Oswego, Oregon, we had a fabulous school. You know, it was computers and everything. Is this just the way it is because of federalism, or do Americans need to look at this and address it?
I think Americans and Congress and the administration need to look at this because, as you've indicated, I think here in the Midwest, in Topeka, the Kansas City area, we have some of the best schools in the whole country, and I truly mean that. And you've also mentioned some of the urban school districts, Detroit and Chicago and other places, where there are tremendous social problems in some of these urban school districts. And you know, I guess it's a little unrealistic for us, and I say us in Congress and probably the American people, to say, well, if you have small classrooms and good teachers, then kids should learn. I was over in Kansas City, Kansas about 3 years ago with Ray Daniels, who's the superintendent of Kansas City, Kansas schools. We were in an elementary school classroom, and he said, Dennis, you see that little girl over there? And I said, yes. And he said, she slept in a car with her mom last night because she didn't have a home. And he said, how can we expect a little person like that to focus on education and learning when she wonders where she's going to be sleeping tonight? And I mean, there's a lot more that goes into education than just good teachers and kids who want to learn. It also takes parents at home who encourage their kids and encourage them to study at night and learn what needs to be learned. And if we have kids who are homeless, they're way behind the 8 ball, and they really don't have the chance that other kids have.
Let's move over to a couple of President Bush's more recent proposals. One is the idea of guest workers from other countries, especially Mexico. What do you think of that idea? And is illegal immigration a big problem, as some think it is in the United States?
Well, it is a problem. And as a district attorney, a former prosecutor for 12 years, I can't say we can't or shouldn't enforce laws. We have immigration laws, and they should be enforced. On the other hand, as I said, there's at least 2 sides to every story, and you need to look at this, and it's a complex problem. We have, and I saw estimates as high as 8-9 million immigrants in this country who are illegals, and a lot of them from Mexico. And they are doing jobs in this country that sometimes Americans don't want to do. I'm talking about landscaping jobs. I'm talking about work in homes for people. And if these people, 8 million, say, pick a number, were to be deported tomorrow, there'd be a tremendous void in the job market right now. I think that still some Americans wouldn't want to do these jobs. But we've got to find a way to address this issue and recognize that there are some people who are here, maybe here illegally, and somehow they want to correct the situation. I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm looking right now at the President's proposal. In fact, I had a group of people in last week, community leaders up in my district, to talk about this, some from the Hispanic community. And some of them say the President's proposal doesn't go far enough. Other people would say, well, it goes too far. So this is one of those difficult issues we're going to have to study and sort out, and I think come as a nation to some consensus here about what to do with this.
What about driver's licenses? This is a Kansas issue, and people say, well, illegal immigrants are driving anyway. Yeah. But on the other hand, people also say, well, when they go and enroll for their driver's license, then they should be deported because they're illegal immigrants. So it's sort of, if it's illegal to be here and then you go get a driver's license, that you're not enforcing the law. So isn't that a strange
tough issue again?
Well?
It is a strange situation, and I think common sense says if we're going to have people driving anyway, we'd like to have them licensed, make sure they know what the rules of the road are, and also have insurance in case something happens. On the other hand, we have to enforce our immigration laws. So there's a conflict here, and we've got to find a way to resolve this conflict.
And what have you decided yet where you stand on that?
As I said, I'm studying this. I'm meeting with community groups and hearing input from the community, and we're going to see what they say, and then I'm going to have to make a decision if it comes up in Congress. There's some cynics in Congress who say that the President doesn't really want to push this. He just brought it up to try to get the Hispanic vote, but I don't believe that.
Oh, politics. I can't believe you would bring up something like that. Goodness gracious. Interesting thing the President has been talking about, which is the space program. Yes. We haven't heard a lot about that in the last few years. And President Bush wants to go back to the moon, and then...
or at least send somebody to the moon.
Thank you very much. You're exactly right. And send somebody to Mars, right, and make an American presence on Mars. Is this, considering the deficits, is this the right time for this, or is it always a good time to dream, basically?
Well, I hope it's always a good time to dream, but I think we also have to focus on the realities, and the reality is we have a $477 billion deficit this year, which is the highest deficit in our nation's history. And I think a lot of, obviously when you have deficits like this, it makes you focus even more intensely, I think, on our priorities. And when it comes to the priorities discussion and trying to arrive at some consensus in Congress and with the American people, I think a lot of people are going to be saying, wait a minute, how can we afford to do this right now when we have underfunded education programs such as No Child Left Behind, 43 million people uninsured in this country, and a whole host of other problems. And so while I'm glad that President Kennedy dreamed about man going to the moon, and that happened ultimately, we have to have a discussion and arrive at some consensus about whether it's the appropriate time to put billions of dollars into a new space project. And I'm on the Science Committee. I'd like to be able to see us do that. On the other hand, we have these other priorities.
Well, it didn't deter China, which needs
right,
a lot of money, and They want to send somebody to the moon. So I guess it is more of a trade-off between the ineffable joy of accomplishing something like that versus the realities, as you say, of the budget. Let's move on to foreign policy. There's not a lot going on in foreign policy, so we don't really have much to talk about.
I come home every week and people say, how are things in Washington? I say, well, except for the situation in Iraq and the $477 billion deficit, everything's great. But
let's talk about Iraq. First of all, let's go pre-war, pre-invasion. Did you vote for authorization for President Bush to use the necessary means to oust Saddam Hussein, and what did you base that vote on?
There was a use of force resolution that came up in, I believe, in October of last year. I voted for the use of force resolution. I say last year, actually, it was the year before. And I based that on 5 or 6 classified briefings that I had and one unclassified briefing that I can discuss here, because to me it was one of the most instructive of the briefings that I had. In August, prior to that vote, we had not had one single classified briefing on the situation in Iraq, and this was the August after the President first identified what he called the axis of evil, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea.
I have to interrupt you,
Sure.
because I'm sure these were all classified, but we all know now that whatever they said was probably wrong.
Well, you may be being facetious, but that's actually true.
Sorry, go ahead.
In fact, no, you're right.
They didn't know that at the time.
The information I had in the classified briefings, and I can't obviously discuss that, but I can tell you about one morning in October, I was invited to the Pentagon for a briefing with Secretary Rumsfeld and General Myers. And I listened for about an hour, hour and 15 minutes to what they told us. And that afternoon I had my first and I think my only unclassified briefing back at the Rayburn office building, the House office building, and it was with a man by the name of David Kay, who was the chief weapons inspector back in '91 for the United Nations in Iraq.
Right, and I'm not trying to be cruel.
No.
David Kay is the one that says
Absolutely.
they all were wrong.
That's where I'm coming. That's where I'm coming to right now. It was with David Kay and with a guy named Martin Indyk, who was the ambassador to Israel under President Clinton. And my thought was, I heard from Rumsfeld and Myers that morning, and I'm going to hear something different, the other side of the story, if you will, this afternoon. And what I heard that afternoon from David Kay and from Martin Indyk was essentially just like, almost like that with what I'd heard that morning from Rumsfeld and Myers. And in fact, David Kay talked about us going in with weapons inspector after the first Gulf War, weapons inspectors, and finding some weapons of mass destruction, and it is an absolute fact, uncontested, that Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons which he used against the Kurds in his country and against the people in Kuwait, and killed thousands of people. I think there was also strong evidence, and Kay told us indications that some biological weapons were found. And he said even the weapons inspectors were basically thrown out of Iraq back in 1998 by Saddam Hussein. So he says what happened between '98 and up to the date I heard this briefing before we went into Iraq, he says we don't know what's happened since 1998 there. But he says I can tell you that we had intelligence sources in Iraq prior to 1998 that told us there was a nuclear weapons program under development in Iraq. He said we went to those places, we found what they had done. They didn't have it hadn't been developed fully yet, but it was underway. He says we destroyed everything they had. And somebody asked him, well, you said we've been out since 1998. How long would it take for him to go back and reconstitute that weapons program for nuclear weapons? He said, my best guess, and he said, this is just a guess, is about 5 years, which would put us up to 2003. And that, to me, was as instructive as I said, as anything I heard in the classified briefings, because here was a man who was not in this administration, who was the chief weapons inspector for the United Nations back in 1991, and was basically confirming what we'd heard from Rumsfeld and Myers, plus giving us some additional information. And that caused me to vote for this. Now, I hoped and believed at the time that the President, if he ever exercised this authority we gave him, would follow the same model he did after September 11. When he picked up the phone, he called world leaders and he said, this is not just an attack on America, it's an attack on us, on freedom. You should be with us. And he assembled the greatest coalition of nations we've ever had. We had more goodwill coming towards our country from other nations, and I hoped and believed the President would do that again before going into Iraq. Unfortunately, the model changed. He decided we wanted to exercise total military control about how it was going to happen, And we did not get this coalition of nations together at the outset, except for Great Britain and a handful of others. But the fact was, we've done 90%, they did 10%, and we're right now spending $1 billion a week and 1 to 3 American lives on a good day in Iraq. And it should have been an international operation instead of just us alone.
Yeah, I think you're right, and almost everybody thought that there was something there. There was some sort of program, and what we've found in Libya is that when the UN inspectors have been in Libya, there's several sites they had no idea were there. Now that the Libyans are coming clean, so it was very, probable, and so it is a surprise that they weren't found. I guess the question is, given that we didn't know, but should the president have stressed more that this is more of a long-term threat than just we're going in to get rid of those weapons of mass destruction before the war? Because I think most Americans supported the idea that Saddam Hussein had to go. I think the complaint simply is there was really maybe no need to pump up what may have been questionable material about the weapons of mass destruction.
I'm very concerned, and I think the issue here that David Kay has raised recently in his testimony to the Senate committee is that maybe our intelligence sources didn't provide us with correct information. I was an intelligence officer when I was in the Army, and I understand that intelligence information is information that's gathered, and somebody has to judge it for credibility and reliability, and mistakes can be made there, so I understand that. But I think what you're going to see, and probably what we should have in the next year in Congress, after this presidential election, I suppose, are some sort of hearings to determine whether we have sufficient intelligence sources right now in terms of human capability and not just this electronic intelligence that everybody's talked about. And that's where we may have some shortage and need to beef up is our human intelligence sources, because we need to be able to rely on the information we have and make judgments about that and not make mistakes like we made here. Now, I don't hear anybody say, I wish Saddam Hussein were still in power and control in Iraq, in this country. I mean, I think most Americans, 99%, are probably glad he's gone, even if they don't support the fact that we went into Iraq. But we are there now. We have soldiers. There are about 130,000 troops there, and we've got to support our troops, and I'm really proud of the American people for supporting our troops, because I think finally, as contrast to what happened back in Vietnam, people back there disrespected our troops many times when they came back just because they disagreed with our policy about being there. I think finally the American people understand they're there by order of their commander-in-chief. They're doing the job that they were sent there to do. Even if the policy is wrong, it's not their fault if the policy is wrong.
You mentioned that you wish the president would have been able to get more of a coalition.
Yes, sir.
Given that he wasn't able to, did you still support the invasion with the small group that was with us, Australia, Great Britain, Poland, and a number of other nations?
If I had been the king, it would have been different than that, but I don't have control. The president did. What I would have preferred to see, he did get a coalition together, but not nearly the kind of coalition I would like to have seen. I think if he had listened to some people in his administration, such as Secretary Powell, for whom I have great respect, and I think Secretary Powell counseled him to go to our NATO allies early on, not 8 months after the fact, but early on, when he first identified this axis of evil. And if he had done that and gone to some of our United Nations allies, I think we could have had a different coalition, a bigger coalition, and a lot more legitimacy in the eyes of the world. And I tell people we're the only superpower in the whole world right now, but it's in our interest not to act that way to everybody else, because if we do, we just make the rest of the world angry at us. And I think that's what's seen. This great reservoir of goodwill that was coming towards our nation after September 11 has just been, it's gone. It's gone.
I want to get back to that, but I want to specifically, you've been to Iraq, correct?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that visit, and then I want to just ask you, you can follow up. Do you believe that the post-war policy has gone well, and what should or could be changed based on your visit and your
I went there with a couple of objectives, and one was to find out. I met last September with families of military personnel out in Olathe, reserve units, and around the whole area. They came to me expressing concerns, mostly wives and moms, expressing concerns about some of their husbands and sons over there didn't even have the Kevlar inserts for their vests, their protective armor. And I was very concerned about that and had a chance to discuss that with Secretary Rumsfeld about 2 or 3 weeks after my meeting with the families. And he said that is a problem. It's a problem of manufacturing. We're trying to address that. And I believe that, in fact, by the time I got there in early January of this year, just this month, I think most of that's been corrected. They also said that early on at least, their soldiers over there didn't have sufficient supplies of water and food. That's been corrected as well by my conversations with the people there. And I think for the most part, our troops there have what they need now. There's some areas, but for the most part. As far as what happens in the future, there is something happening there right now in Iraq that I think is good, and that is an effort to train Iraqi people for security forces in Iraq, and the intention is by about the first part of July to start to pull some of the troops not out of country but out of the population areas like Baghdad and Tikrit and move the Iraqi security forces in there, so it appears not to be Americans against the Iraqi people, but Iraqi people actually providing security for the Iraqi people there in those population centers. That's going to, there are some people, I think, the loyalists to Saddam Hussein, who want it to make it look like it's a war against Muslim. And to the extent that we can transfer this security keeping authority to the Iraqi people, it's going to be better for us and for them, and it's going to cut down, I hope, on the number of lives of Americans that are lost there.
Now, did you just meet with American soldiers, or were you able to be briefed or talk to Iraqis as well?
We met with people from the Iraqi Security Council, the governing council, which is, and there's an ambitious program there that I hope can succeed. I'm not sure that it will. And that is to transfer political power to this new Iraqi government by about July 1st. They're in the process, Bob, of writing a constitution and trying to establish certain protections and liberties for the people in Iraq, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, equality of the male and female gender, and the best intentions of the world. And one person said to us during a discussion, she said, you know, y'all had, she didn't say y'all, but she said, y'all had several years in your country to write and draft this Constitution. You had a history and tradition of democracy. She said, we don't have that. We've had dictators for 40 years here. And I don't know how you, with the best intentions in the world, can say, well, in 4 or 5 months, we want you to write this Constitution, transfer power, and have an election, and it all get up and running like a democracy. That's ambitious. I hope it works, but maybe 5 months is not realistic in terms of a time frame.
Well, in Japan, we essentially wrote their constitution, and we had the luxury of there wasn't any attacks. There wasn't any movement against our occupation.
Right.
And so, as I think you're right, it's unfortunate that we don't have the luxury of time here, because we really do want to transfer over as quickly as possible. How involved are Americans in writing this Constitution that you could see there?
My understanding is they're giving some guidance, suggestions, but my personal feeling is we can't impose the kind of government we want them to have. If it's not something that they design themselves and can live with in the future, it's probably not going to work. That's my personal feeling. And maybe I'm wrong, but that's the way I look at it here.
Because, you know, Kuwait is one of our allies,
Yes.
and women can't vote in Kuwait.
Yes.
And many, I think Americans would think it's a little odd that we would go, American soldiers would go over and die, and then a constitution that would rise up, for example, that would have no rights for women. So that's why I ask how involved Americans are in this process, I guess.
That isn't really clear to me, but I suspect there's more involvement than maybe there should be. But again, my personal feeling is they're going to have to design something they can live with in the future.
You mentioned the axis of evil.
That's not my term. That's President Bush's.
That's right. Iran and North Korea. Let's start with Iran. Interesting country where there seems to be a movement that was stymied for reform there. Is this a country where we don't threaten, but instead try to negotiate with, versus the policy we had with Iraq?
Well, I hope so. And I think it's important that we not see a proliferation, a spread of so-called weapons of mass destruction among other countries in this world. But frankly, we don't have the military resources or the moral authority, in my judgment, to go around and try to take on every problem in the world in terms of we don't agree with another government. I think it's in our interest, again, as the only superpower in the world, to sit down and develop a relationship and talk with people. I think nations are much like people. If somebody does something you don't like, another person, you can either pick a fight or go to war with them in essence, or you can sit down and try to say, I don't like what happened here, let's discuss this and see if we can find a reasonable solution. And we need to do more of that, and I think to the extent that we're able to develop long-term relationships with other nations, even ones we may have had huge disagreements with in the past, it's going to be in our interest in the future to do that, because if we do that, when something goes wrong, as something inevitably will, then you maybe hopefully have a forum and a way and a relationship to sit down and want to resolve those differences. And to the extent we can develop trade ties or other relationships, exchange of students, whatever, that gives us more incentive, I think, to resolve problems peacefully in the future.
And that's a difficult approach, because with the Soviet Union, we finally sort of came up with this idea of Ronald Reagan decided, let's confront them, but that doesn't mean we cut off ties.
Exactly.
We would trade, we'll have sports events, we'll talk to each other, but we'll tell them we're not happy. So what do we do with a country like, North Korea? And I'm a political scientist, so this is not a political science term, but where they have almost an insane type of regime. Do we completely cut them off and say everything about you just goes against everything we believe in, or do we engage in a dialogue which some would argue then perpetuates the regime?
I don't agree that engaging in a dialogue and trying to develop a relationship perpetuates a regime or even condones that regime. I think it's in our interest to try to do that. An example, I was down in Havana, Cuba about a year and a half ago, met with a guy by the name of Fidel Castro, who's been in control in Cuba for 40 years, longest serving world leader. And I told people when I got back, I said, there's some good news and bad news about Fidel Castro. The good news is he's extremely intelligent, he's got a great sense of humor. The bad news is he's still a socialist and he's got a little problem with human rights. But a majority of the members of the House, Republicans and Democrats, voted to develop additional trade ties and allow ease travel restrictions between America and Cuba. And yet the president, this is not partisan, it goes back to President Clinton and now President Bush, has said we're not going to do that. And to me this is just kind of a nonsense policy. It doesn't make sense, because the way I think that we beat Castro at his own game is to let Americans go down there, the Cuban people, to see what we have. And I'm not just talking about material things, I'm talking about freedoms. And they're going to say, we want what they have, and that's going to change. I mean, Castro's in his 70s anyway. He won't be around forever. And that's
what they said about Khomeini and Deng Xiaoping.
I know. The best thing we can do, though, I think, honestly, is develop additional relationships and ties with these people in Cuba and other nations like that. And I think, just like what happened with the Soviet Union, our form of government freedom and free enterprise is going to win out. I really believe that.
I was in Cuba about 2 years ago, and I didn't get to meet Fidel Castro, so you must have better connections than me.
It's the job.
I think if we completely opened up with Cuba, I don't know how long they'd last. I mean, 90 miles away, television, culture, trade, it would seem like they would last it would be a much more shorter time where they'd be under that communist regime if it was opened up. So that begs the question.
That's what I believe too.
Is it just all domestic politics then?
I think, honestly, that policy is controlled by a relatively small group of people down in South Florida who came here from Cuba. And it's presidential politics, and Florida has a lot of presidential votes, electoral votes, and I think that's what determines that policy. And unfortunately, I think we should listen to common sense and not just politics.
And do the people you talk to in Washington who support the current Cuba policy literally give you a straight face when they do it, and they say, well, we think this will change the regime, when, of course, we're dealing with regimes worse all across the world?
Absolutely. No, there's not that much discussion about it. When it comes up for a vote, there's some discussion then, and everybody gets up and says their respective pieces. But I think most people in Congress, whichever side of that debate they're on, know the realities.
And what about in China? Do you support the engagement policy with China?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I was in China in the last year, and that is a sleeping giant that's going to be a superpower, I believe, in the future. I don't know how many years it's going to take, but they have such a tremendous population. They have a lot of resources. They have a lot of challenges there, too, for sure. But I think it's in our interest, again, to be constructively engaged in relationships with China and make sure that we have ties So when we do have differences, as have happened in the past few years, we can resolve those peacefully and not go to war.
Vice President Cheney a few days ago said that we're not an empire, United States.
Glad to hear that.
And that's sort of a dirty word. And yet, when I look up sort of what an empire means, we have troops in over 100 countries, and we have hundreds of thousands of troops all over the world. And maybe we're not a traditional empire, but we're some kind of empire right now. I mean, I guess the word is superpower. What is our role in the world, and can it last, or do we need to think about changing it fairly soon? And we only have a few minutes,
yeah,
so just a brief...
I don't mean to... I just want to say this. I think our country, honestly, is the greatest country in the whole world. I'm not just saying that to appease people out there. We have more liberties and freedoms in this country than people all around almost any other country in the world. And people, in fact, around the world have died to try to get some of the things we have in terms of personal liberties and economic liberties and freedoms here. And so I think to the extent that we can be a good neighbor and a good member of the world community and develop these relationships with other nations, we could see other changes like the crumbling of the Soviet Union, and now we have Russia. Who would have believed 15 years ago the Soviet Union would no longer be a superpower? Now it doesn't even exist. And our system will win out if people see it and have the opportunity to see it. And just keeping to ourselves and not engaging in these relationships and developing constructive alliances with other nations, I think, is counterproductive for us and for these other nations.
Well, we're basically out of time. Do you plan to run again?
I'm not going to make an announcement this morning, but I think if you're a betting person, it'd probably be a safe bet.
And just one or two words, if you were to run, what are the 2 or 3 issues that will be most important in running?
Fiscal responsibility, our deficit, our budget is 1. Education is 2. And health care and prescription drugs, those things, is a 3rd one. And trying to be a good member of this world community is a 4th one.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Glad to be with you, Bob.
I want to thank Representative Dennis Moore for taking the time to talk to us. I also want to thank KTWU in Topeka for producing this and other public affairs programs and their commitment to public participation in our democratic system. Keep your eyes open for further programs in the coming months with Kansas leaders and policymakers. But for now, it's time for us to go. Goodbye.
Painting pictures of the world to help viewers make sense of it all. Watch BBC World News.
In today's global marketplace, what's going on in Shanghai or Singapore can be just as important as what's happening in New York or